The House has resumed. Members, the House is debating the first reading of the Local Government Act 2002 Amendment Bill. Andrew Williams has the call. You have about 8 minutes remaining, Mr Williams.
Mr Speaker.
Andrew Williams.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Where we left off just before the dinner break, I was giving you details of how the national government cannot be trusted when it comes to local government. From 9 years of experience in local government, I certainly came to learn how the National Party, both in opposition and then subsequently in government, could simply not be trusted. And I mentioned before the dinner break how John Key, as a backbench MP back in 2005-06, put a private member's bill forward to the House, which was not pulled from the ballot, to create a super city in Auckland. When they then became the government, they handed that over to Rodney Hyde and gave him the dirty work, but basically John Key's paws were all over it, and it was his idea in the first place to create the super city, to back their rich mates in Auckland, to corporatise Auckland and to create all the council-controlled and to create all the council-controlled organisations that are now seeing water bills in Auckland being posted out on a monthly basis under water care, that are now seeing weeds growing all over Auckland where they weren't growing before, which are now seeing the destruction of many of the services that were previously available in parts of Auckland, which are now all being centred on the centre of Auckland, and where basically local government in Auckland in many respects, particularly in the case of communities, is going backwards. And we must recall that in those days when the National Party was still in opposition, it promised prior to the 2008 election that it would consult with the people of Auckland on the creation of the Auckland One Council, and it said it would consult on the outcomes of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Auckland. Well, 6 months later, after the election, such agreement to consult with the people of Auckland disappeared out the window when the Commission reported on the 31st of March of 2008, and subsequently within 10 days, Rodney Hyde threw that 800-page, $5 million report out the window and came up with his 34-page result for Auckland. That was an example of how the National Party works with local government, and this latest local government reform is basically a continuation of that, where they basically give lip service to local government in this country. We must remember that in Australia they have three levels of government. They have federal government, they have state government, and then they have local government. Whereas here in New Zealand we only have two levels of government, that is our central government and our local government. And yet this central government seems to want to get its paws all over our local level of democracy and wants to basically have the minister determining so much of what will happen within the local councils, within the local authorities. And Mr Speaker, we have to remember where local government came out of. From hundreds and hundreds of years of history of town councils, of town shires, of representatives of a town or a village or whatever, being chosen by the people of their town or village or district to represent the interests of the greater mass of people in that area and to do the work on behalf of that community. That is what local government's all about, and it's not for central government, which is supposed to work on high-level policy, high-level planning, high-level direction of central government issues, to start delving into how a local council should operate. Mr Speaker, I mentioned before the dinner that there was the Shand report in 2008, a very extensive report into the rating structure in New Zealand and how local councils should be funded. And this report, which was delivered by the Commissioner, mentioned that local government in New Zealand was some of the most efficient local government there was anywhere in the world, and that New Zealand local government was the envy of local government around the world. But it also said that New Zealand local government was sitting on about $100 billion of assets, but only had about $2 billion of debts. And if New Zealand was to increase its infrastructure and grow its infrastructure and improve its infrastructure, those balance sheets of the councils should be leveraged to a higher degree, and they should take on longer-term debt to pay for the infrastructure within New Zealand, which central government could not afford to fund. And therefore, over the last 7 or 8 years, that has been an ongoing case where councils have extended their debt. For instance, the North Shore, we built a $120 million sewerage outfall pipeline to go 3.9 kilometres out into the Hauraki Gulf, that was costing $120 million, a lot of money for a population of 230,000 people. But because we amortised it over 50 years and we took a long-term debt on that and we made intergenerational debt as part of that whole loan, we could afford to do that and basically provide the sewage services for the community, not just for the 50 years life of the loan, but for the next 100 years that the asset would be there. And in that respect, when councils in New Zealand are turning over in the order of $7.5 billion a year, the councils, an $8 billion debt across our councils is not a huge amount of money in the greater scheme of things. When you think that this national government in 3 short years took the national debt, I'm not talking the National Party debt, I'm talking about the national debt of this country, from $8 billion to over $50 billion today, which is an extraordinary loading of debt in 3 short years, and where they're projecting over the next 3 years, it will go to $72 billion. It's so hypocritical of them, it's the pot calling the kettle black, to then have the Honourable Nick Smith say that local councils went from $2 billion to $8 billion debt when they've got $100 billion in assets, while central government, this national government, has gone from $8 billion of debt and will end up at $72 billion of debt. Mr. Speaker, another example of where National kicked local government in the teeth well and truly was a situation where Auckland was trying to fend for itself, was trying to provide for itself, needed the infrastructure, and was prepared to put in a regional fuel tax to start at 2 cents a litre and to rise to 9 cents a litre over a period of 4 or 5 years. It was negotiated over a period of 3 years with central government, and it was going to help fund much of Auckland's infrastructure and pay for the likes of the rail, the ferries and public transport, buses and all sorts of things out of a fairly charged petrol tax across the region. What did the national government do? They got into power, and within months they kicked the proposed regional fuel tax in Auckland for touch and cancelled it. It would have by now today been producing more than $1 billion a year for the Auckland region to pay for public transport and to pay for infrastructure in Auckland. But what did they do? They took it away, but typical of the national government, didn't replace it with anything. And then they have ridden on the strings of the former government, and which was in partnership with the New Zealand First Party at the time, which was already rolling out the projects such as the Western Ring Route and rolling out the Northern Busway and rolling out the motorway extension to the west. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, in closing, I just say that I am very tired of people from the National Party who know nothing about local government, have spent no time in local government, spouting on about what they know about local government. And quite frankly, this latest reform of the Local Government Act 2002, this later reform, is basically taking the councils right back to where they were maybe 20 or 30 years ago, where they simply had a town clerk who fixed some potholes, did some footpaths, and maybe fixed up the roads and patched up the local hall. Well, the days of that have gone, and the days of local communities expecting much more from their local community is here, and it's a very sorry day in this country, Mr. Speaker, that this National Party is going back to those days.
Nikki Kay.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to speak on the Local Government Act